Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome to CNE. My name is Andrew Robinson. I was until recently the program manager with the Center for Nonprofit Excellence. I've recently moved into a part-time contract position and am a homeschooling dad teacher person these days, which is wonderful. But happy to be back doing this and sharing this important information with everyone about the ARPA funding and ways to sort of help you all get connected with that and understand what you need to have in place to secure the funding if possible and what to do with it afterwards. So again, focusing on advocacy, on grant writing and evaluation, packed into a pretty tight schedule, but hopefully enough time for us to learn some things and ask some questions. Before we go any further, I want to acknowledge that CNE's Charlottesville office is located on the ancestral land of the Monacan Indian Nation, and I will share a link to their website in case you're interested in learning more about them. So today we're going to hear from three speakers, Kaki Dimmick, Susie Miller, and Mary Frances Porter. I'll say a little bit about each of them in more detail before they jump in. There may be some time after each of the speakers for a question or two, but there'll definitely be some time at the end for larger questions. And as you may have noticed, I am recording this session, so if you need to jump out early, I'll be sending that around either later today or early next week. So I'd like to get started. Our first speaker is Kaki Dimmick. Kaki has a pretty extensive history working with the city of Charlottesville, but also with nonprofit organizations that are sort of closely aligned with municipal government. So through her experience has gained some expertise about that relationship and relationship building. So we invited her to share some things on how to advocate for yourself as a nonprofit with those kinds of government bodies. So I'm going to turn things over to Kaki and pull up her slides for her.
Good morning, everybody. I have just 5 slides, and they will mostly just help me stay focused so that I don't go too far afield. Will I see them when they come up from my vantage point? Okay, great. You're muted in case you're...
Slight technical issues, sorry.
Okay.
Here we are.
ARPA money, that's all. We're looking for it. It seems to be all over the place, but we're looking for it. So I just want to say a few things. I guess my overall sort of frame for this conversation is that ARPA money is not CARES money. And if you've had any experience with CARES money, you have been set up to assume something that's really different in terms of its process and protocols than the ARPA money. And I think it's important to acknowledge that that's kind of different than what we heard when the ARPA money first came out. Like with the CARES money, the money got established and started the amounts and the fact of it started coming into the sort of the perspective and the reality of all of us way before any kind of requirements or guidance came from federal sources. And so it's important that usually we start with the guidance well before we get to a place where we actually have the money. In this case, we were sort of told it's going to be flexible, it's going to be responsive. And then over time, the feds actually started to apply additional regulations around expectations and reporting. And so that didn't really happen for CARES money. CARES money was fast money and it was fairly flexible in its use. And ARPA is a little bit more structured. And I think so for those of you who have been thinking that CARES money and ARPA money are similar, I think it's really important to separate those things out. So ARPA money is the American Rescue Plan Act, and I mostly say that out loud for myself because I'm always getting the ARPA mixed up for what it actually means. It's the American Rescue Plan Act, and it allows for financial support in 4 specific categories. And I'm sharing this information because I think this is really critical for the way that you should approach your local governments and the way that the kind of proposals that you all might make. One is responding to the public health emergency. So this is anything that has to do with responding to COVID-19, whether that's really practical things like additional PPE or even public health expenses. But it could also be the way your organization had to rearrange itself around supporting workers in the public health emergency. And importantly, this category also includes its negative economic impacts. And so the larger statement, I think, is responding to public health emergency and its negative economic impacts. And so this category of responding to the negative economic impacts is probably a fairly good place to find most of your proposals for social services anyway. Responding to public health emergency and negative economic impacts. And then two, supporting essential workers. And so this is essentially a premium pay category for folks who are first responders, folks who were on the front lines, I think essential workers. We've heard lots of language around that. And if you read the full ARPA Act, you'll see that there's actually lots of definitions around what those things actually mean according to the feds. This is just a way to provide additional support for those folks who are working during a time in which many people got to come home or telework. Three is government services, and this is a really important distinction. Government services can be paid for using ARPA funds to the extent that they're covering missing or dramatically reduced tax revenue for the period. And so often money can't be used to supplant lost revenue or particularly lost tax revenue for government. But in this case, ARPA money can be used for that. And it's important that you all know that, because that means your local government is also in competition for this available money. And so if the local government is in a position to have sharply reduced tax revenue, and many municipalities do, interestingly, many municipalities don't, but if they are in that position, then they're going to be looking for some of that money to support their own institution and own organization. It's important that you know that for your locality. And four, interestingly, investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. And so that I think their interest there is expanding both permanent infrastructure and capacity across the board. So this is kind of a rare opportunity to invest for local government to invest in some of these larger infrastructure projects. So in the next slide, you'll see that the ARPA funds, Andrew, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So the reporting categories, and this is important because it further refines those four items that the money may be used for by saying that when you report out, the local government has to report out which category the project falls under. And so this gives you a little bit more insight into some of the things they anticipate. So public health costs, which seems very obvious, negative economic impacts, services to disproportionately impacted communities. There's lots of ways to define that, including by census tract. Premium pay, water, sewer, broadband infrastructure, revenue loss, and administrative costs. So in the next slide, local governments are doing this differently, and I think it's important that you know that. So, and if you sort of do any kind of Google search across the country, you'll see that it's kind of radically different how a local governments are doing this. Some are looking at existing needs assessment data to determine where to invest, and so that it's important to know that that needs assessment data may be old. That the current needs around the pandemic, around community need, might be radically different for your organization or for your locality during the pandemic than they were before. But it's important to know that if your local government is using needs assessment data from pre-pandemic times to determine where to invest, it could also still be a really great idea. Supporting unmet strategic goals that clearly align. I think this is a message you'll probably hear again and again or see again and again in any of the recommendations around ARPA, is having a very intentional strategic use of that money. And so local governments some local governments are saying we're going to use our ARPA funds to match the strategic goals that we already have, and we're going to just proceed to make those determinations and allocations internally only. Some are opening up an application process. Sometimes that application process is just a way to communicate directly with local government. So it's just a mechanism for getting in front of the decision makers. Sometimes that application process is competitive. And sometimes that application process looks more like an RFP, like the very intentional, specific request for proposals to meet a need that's been identified by the local government. And some are establishing advisory boards to inform decision making. So they're saying this is not, we know that we're not the experts in this area, and so we're going to convene an advisory board who will then tell us where we should be focused. And then some are actually convening steering committees that actually make allocation decisions. And so they're being given some proportion of whatever the ARPA distribution is to that locality and told you all, as long as they're compliant and aligned with the ARPA requirements, you all are in a position to make the decision about where those things go. It is also possible that your local government is doing all 5 of these approaches, and that's important for you to know too. So my recommendations, which are on the, I think that the next and last slide. So obviously put your best foot forward. I think it's really important, particularly if you have any kind of brain frame that says this is sort of like the CARES money, which was a little bit like the Wild Wild West, lots of money coming down, fairly flexible distribution, very limited reporting back to the feds. This is not that. And so I would recommend that you treat this like a more traditional grant proposal. The timeline for this money is through December 2024. So if you've been thinking about it as sort of an emergent amount of money that has to be spent this year or next year, that's not true. So if you begin to think about this as a timeline that stretches to 2024, then you can sort of take a breath and say, we need to be more formal and intentional about our proposal. Obviously, I think it's really important to reach out to the people that you know in local government and find out how and when to submit. And I say that, it seems very obvious, but there's two reasons. One, please don't assume that you're already on the mind of your local government folks. They are busy. We are busy doing the thing that's right in front of us. And so we're not necessarily thinking more broadly about what's happening in our community. And so it's important to remind or nudge or suggest, like, there's a need here that we've identified as a nonprofit or as an initiative, and this is what we're doing to meet that need, just as a reminder to get on the top of those folks' minds. Also, I think it's really important to be that nudge if local governments haven't figured out how best to distribute the money. They're really looking for suggestions about how best to use this sort of one-time windfall for the community in a way that has the best possible impact. And if you have an idea about that, don't hold back. And don't wait for your local government folks to issue some sort of formal, like, this is the way we're approaching this. People are scrambling. This is a lot of money to distribute in a way that's really meaningful for the community. So I wouldn't wait. I would reach out early and often, I guess is what I would say. Obviously, make it easy for folks to say yes. And I mean this in all sincerity. If you do your homework just like you do with a traditional grant proposal, where you read through the language that people are hoping to have included in your proposal, and you're meeting the needs that the people at the RFP has identified, then you're making it easy for people to say yes. Match your proposal to strategic goals. So your strategic goals, for sure, very interesting, but probably more importantly in this case, the local government strategic goals. And we know that those goals include 2 things. One is meeting emergent human service needs, that all local governments are scrambling to make sure that we can address the significant economic impacts on our communities. And that includes not only just sort of increased caseloads in terms of people being in immediate financial need, but also the acuity of that need. And that bumps up and shows up in all kinds of places. And so your service is something that the community needs, and local governments will benefit from. So if you're addressing an emergent human service needs, don't hold back. Definitely submit a proposal and ask for funds to help to do that. And then if you can align with existing strategic plans, I think it's really important to know what sort of strategic framework your local government is operating under, particularly where those unmet needs are and how you might be able to help fill them. Obviously, I submit a well-founded argument. And so I mean this like, if you have a well-founded, detailed, not particularly long necessarily, but argument for why this money is going to be useful, you may jump to the head of the line because you've already provided essentially incredible documentation about why this is necessary and how it is you're going to fulfill this need, which does the local government's work in terms of reporting for it. And so it is really important that if you submit a letter, for example, for CARES money, you might have submitted a letter and said, hey, we need a couple $100,000 to do this important critical service. In the CARES Act world, you might have had a local government representative who would say, yes, that sounds exactly right. Please go forth and do it, and craft a couple paragraph MOU that would be sufficient to move forward. That's not true now, and the feds are expecting a great deal of documentation and reporting back, and you're going to hear more about how you can set that structure up later, including performance indicators. And so realistic performance indicators, how you're going to track them, and there'll be a quarterly, I think at least a quarterly, there might even be some monthly requirements about how you report that stuff out to your local government. In this case, I think it's really important to avoid the creation of an entirely new thing. Unless you can really demonstrate that it is a truly temporary need, which seems unlikely. I think we have continued to assume that the needs would begin to taper off. And that has not been my experience in the social human services world. Or if you can realistically sustain it. And I think it would be unwise to say that you're going to fundraise to strictly fundraise to support the sustained need. I think you'll need to have a more realistic plan than that. And I think that any withdrawal of that funding that actually matches to a withdrawal of service is going to be painful for both you and for your local government. I think it's also really important to not assume that your local government source is the only source of ARPA money for you. We know that there's been a tremendous amount of ARPA money that has come to the state, and state agencies are still scrambling to figure out how they're going to distribute that, what kind of mechanisms they already have in place that they can just add additional dollars to their threshold amounts, or whether they're going to open up new competitive or have new strategic initiatives. And so please keep an eye on those things that are coming from the state, and spread the wealth around. Ask for support from all of those sources. So that's my guidance about that. I think if you're doing something that you believe the community needs and you need money to do it, I would go immediately to your local government folks and say, how can I give this proposal to you in a way that does your work for you? And helps with your reporting. The reporting burden is much greater than I think anybody anticipated. So that's my primary guidance, and I'm happy to answer questions now or sit back and wait until the other two presenters have gone.
Thanks, Kaki. We did have a couple of questions that I think are really specific to what you're talking about. One was just sort of, are there specific people, I mean, maybe particularly in Charlottesville, Albemarle, board of directors, city council, or is it more specific than that within certain agencies that we need to be reaching?
Certainly for Charlottesville and Albemarle, the budget offices have been the primary drivers of the ARPA funds. And so they're bringing in, of course, all of the content expertise around, but it's the budget office is receiving this amount of money, and it's on the budget office to then determine how best to distribute it. And so again, they may be using existing infrastructures or processes they already have, but I would start with the person you know. And so eventually they're going to get you to the budget office, or they're going to get you to the decision maker. I think it's helpful for both city council and board of supervisors to be advocates, but most of this money is going to be determined probably inside staff. So staff decision making, and then they'll propose like a final sort of a spreadsheet of where the money will go to their elected bodies, which isn't to say these elected bodies can't advocate internally, but I think the strategic way is to start with staff and and start with the person you already have a relationship with, and then let them get you to the process or decision makers.
And is there do you know if there's a form specific at the county or the city right now? Or is it, my sense is that there's so many different ways to get at the money that there'd be a lot of forms.
Exactly. And I think there are going to be lots of forms. And I think that's why it's important to know how your local government is doing it. If there's multiple points, multiple ways. And so, for example, for the county is making some strategic decisions internally about the way to use this money attached to its existing strategic goals, for example, around broadband. And also I'm saying we recognize that we have tremendous emergent needs. Those are well documented. There are gaps in service and gaps in and need around particularly emergency financial assistance. And so we're not going to have a competitive process around that. We're going to say we know what these needs are and we're going to match some funds to those needs. And then there's an anticipated more competitive, slightly competitive process. And I say competitive because there's not enough money probably to meet everyone's needs. And so some determination will have to be made about how we match the need to the resource, but not competitive in the traditional ABRT or vibrant community fund kind of way. But a mechanism like that, like an online portal where you can submit a proposal and it can be reviewed by a group of folks who will then make a recommendation to the internal team, who will then make a recommendation to our elected bodies. And so as you said, I have multiple forms and I think not shared forms. And so my guess is if you're, for example, an organization that spans cities and counties, you're probably going to be making multiple proposals, but hopefully that proposal is the body of it, the frame of it is the same because you've matched it to the goals, you've matched it to the performance indicators, you know it's strategically aligned with what ARPA allows and with the locality needs. And so your format just might change a little bit about how you submit that proposal.
Yeah, thanks for that. There's a couple of things that sort of came across me. One is that, like, depending on where you're located and depending on your specific mission and how you might fit into the ARPA money, the processes are going to be really different. And then also the other thing I'm hearing you say is that all of the decisions about how the money is going to get spent haven't been made yet. So it's going to be an ongoing process to sort of keep up with the decisions that are being made at the government levels. And so those forms or discussion forums or intake forms or whatever it might be are going to be popping up as time goes on. And so we'll send some resources around in our follow-up to help you all get oriented to that. But part of it is going to be sort of trying to keep up with that, and I would imagine that C&E will be right there alongside helping you do that as we go along. So thanks Kaki, and we'll hopefully have some more time for questions for Kaki later, but I would like to move on to our next speaker. Susie Miller is a incredibly experienced grant writer and fundraiser who has been teaching grant writing for many years, and many years for C&E, since C&E has been teaching about grant writing, Susie Miller has been there. So she's done a lot of work with organizations. Many of you probably have worked with her. So I will hand things over to her as I bring up her slides for her.
Actually, just go to the, Andrew, just scroll down to the document that says file cabinet. It's got a list of 24 things. We'll just start there. Hi, everybody. I hope you're having a good day. So I got into this conversation this summer when there was a short-term ARPA application open for arts. And so it was from a specific agency for a specific thing, and it was trying to execute spending out its money for the end of the fiscal year. So that started into conversations about how could organizations be prepared that when these applications and these monies become available, they have all the resources that they need to be able to do what Kaki was just saying, to put these applications together and to be at the top of the pack because they're well informed, they have everything that they need, and they have built their case very strongly. And so this is a piece of the grant writing workbook that we use. And Andrew, just go down to the list on the next page, if you don't mind. So what we do when we teach the grant writing course is there are 24 items that if you will compile them and put them together, it really allows you to have about 80% of your application process done in advance of an application. And so I'm just going to go through these 24 things really quickly. Some of these things will cross over with what Mary Frances is saying from the perspective of you need them, and Mary Frances is going to give you more information about how to compile those and put them together. And so one of them is your mission statement. And a lot of organizations have mission statements that are paragraphs long. Some of them are pages long. You really need a short, almost tagline mission statement so that individuals and organizations can remember you, remember who you are, and remember what you do. The other reason for creating a shorter mission statement is often you are under a character limit when you have to put in your information. And if you have a paragraph long mission statement, you're not going to have enough characters to make that happen. Make sure that you have scanned into your computer your 501c3 letter from the IRS, your DUNS number, your tax ID number. Make sure those are on your computer and readily available so that you're not scrambling around and looking for those. If you do not know what a DUNS number is, you may not have one. And so if you especially are applying to counties and state governments, it's entirely possible that you will need a DUNS number to be eligible for these funds. So it's the Dun & Bradstreet Universal Numbering System, and you can obtain your number from Dun & Bradstreet. If you need more information about that, I will try to get that to Andrew for you. You need a history of your organization. And again, you're going to be under a character count when you're doing this, so you need a brief version, and you might want to also have a longer version. And this should say why you were founded. What was the situation in your community that caused you to be founded, and how you have addressed that over time. If you ever won any awards for the work that you have done, that is the history of your organization. We don't need the history of your town or any of that kind of stuff. Copy of your most recent audit and financial statements. Not all organizations have an audit, and that's okay for most grants. Now, there are grants that will require you to have an audit, and there are multiple kinds of audits that can be done, and the price tags vary based on what those audits are. Now, the financial statements that they're looking for, mostly they are looking for your current operating budget, your projected operating budget for the next fiscal year. They want to see what your project budget is, and that is different from your complete operating budget. It is the project that you are proposing that the grant will pay for. What is that budget? What does it cost? Then they are probably also going to be looking for a profit and loss statement and potentially a balance sheet, okay? Your board members, including their addresses and what their profession is. Even if they're retired, put that they are a retired physician or a retired attorney. And the reason to do this is when you are completing applications, it will let people know, oh, I know that individual and this is where I know them from, and it helps your application move up into the pile, okay? Put together a list of project advisory council members. Some grants require this, not many do, but just have a list of individuals that should you need to have a project advisory council, you can call on them and put them into action, okay? A map of your target area is sometimes asked for. Cities and counties have these on their websites now, so it's very easy to get a copy of your map for your city or county. They want to know the demographics of your target population. So you all are insularly looking right now at Charlottesville, And so if you begin to step back away from Charlottesville, the rest of the state may not know exactly what Charlottesville is like. The rest of the country may not know what Charlottesville is like. And so you need to use your demographics to paint a picture of what your community looks like. So one time I did this workshop in West Virginia, and there was a policeman, and he said, "Do you think it would be helpful for me to say that we have 20 miles of unpaved road?" And I said, "Yes, because that says you are very rural." Okay, so paint a population picture. Okay, you need resumes and of your current staff and the staff that you potentially want to hire. Now, a lot of people will say, "Send me your CV." They don't really mean your CV. CVs are, they could be 80-page documents. It's everything that you have done. They're really looking for a resume to show that your staff has the experience to participate in the project. Job descriptions, again, this is for current staff and potentially proposed staff. Again, and it's to show the grant maker that you have the staff with the experience to do the job for the project that you're proposing. Board resolution letter and minutes of board meeting. It is very important that your board is somehow putting into a document that they know you are writing grants. And this is to protect you and to protect the board, okay? Diversity statement. So a lot of government grants want you to say that you are diverse, but then they do not specify how they want you to be diverse. So there are lots of ways to be diverse. I always suggest that you look at your organization and determine what are the barriers to entry for service from your organization. Those are the places where you need to become more diverse within your organization. And you can do that through trainings. You can do that through offering different services. You can do that through bringing in interpreters. There are lots of different ways that you can address those issues moving forward. Now, future funding statement is, it means how does this project get funded when the grant money goes away? And this will be one of the #1 reasons you are denied a grant, because you cannot tell the funder how you will continue to operate your program once their money goes away. Now, you also need to be able to tell them where your funding sources are coming from. They don't want to be your sole source of support. So where else are you getting funds from? Are you getting them from events? Are you getting them from private donations? Are you getting them from other grants? Are you getting them from collaborative projects? How are you getting them? So when you're putting your budget together on your income side, you need to be able to say, this is where all of my income streams are that are going to help me operate this project. Okay. Evaluation statements. I know that Mary Frances is going to go over evaluation statements, so I'm going to leave that in her wheelhouse and just tell you that you do need to have evaluation statements. Linkage statements are very simple. People make them very hard. What you are doing with linkage statements is letting the funder know that you have researched their information and that you understand the information that they have put forth, but that you are a match to what they're doing. And you can do that in multiple ways. So let's say Kaki puts out an application and you call Kaki and have a conversation with her. When you submit your application, you can send her a note to say, thank you for the call. I really appreciate it. I did this as you suggested. That reminds Kaki that she talked to you, but it builds a link between you and the organization that's offering the funding. That's what linkage statements are, okay? Mission relationship statement. So you've told them what your mission statement is. This is just a statement that says, this project that we're proposing is within the scope of our mission, and this is how we're operating it, and this is what we're doing with it. Capability statement is, these are the individuals that are responsible for operating the project, and you are telling them how those people are capable. Do they have experience? Were they trained? Do they have connections that are going to help them to do that? Do you have a board who has the experience to do that? Or are you going to bring in a consultant? You need to be able to show the funder how you are capable of operating this project. Then there's the statement of social change. This got added to the list when groups like Ben and Jerry's, Seventh Generation, Singing for Change, which is Jimmy Buffett's foundation, these got added to the list when those types of organizations started coming out. They are very, very interested in how do you correct a problem, not fix the problem, but correct the problem. So they would want to know, how are you truly going to stop teen pregnancy? Or how are you truly going to stop juvenile crimes? And so they want to be able to see that their funding is making a positive change in the fabric of society. That's what they are looking for. And sometimes those things are very, very hard to prove, that the project that you are running actually is making that kind of impact in the community. Okay. All right, reciprocity. When you write a state grant or a federal grant, that is FOIA-able information, Freedom of Information Act. So other organizations have the right to see your grant applications and what you submitted in. So if you are looking at state and federal grants, then you can look at funded state and federal grants from other organizations. And that will show you the type of language that was used. That will show you the keywords and phrases that you need to focus on. That will show you how to lay everything out. And it will show you what a funded document looks like. So if you have been funded, someone can also ask you for your information. Now, you only have to share your narrative document. You do not have to share your budget or any other information, only your narrative piece, okay? Now, where reciprocity becomes a problem is, let's say that you have put together a manual for domestic violence, and you used grant funds, federal grant funds, to pay for that manual. If someone requests a copy of that manual, you have to provide it to them through FOIA because it was paid for with federal funds. And so you need to make sure that you have a few additional copies, or that you have money to be able to put that manual forth if someone asks for one, okay? Collaboration is key. I think Kaki and Mary Frances would probably both agree that collaboration is important on almost every kind of grant application that exists. If you are trying to work as a singular organization to try to solve a problem, then you are not truly looking at your whole community. Charlottesville has over 900 nonprofit organizations. There are lots of communities that have 500, 600 nonprofit organizations. So the likelihood that there is an organization that is doing similar work to yours, it's pretty high when those numbers are that large in a community, okay? So I encourage you to reach out and collaborate. Now, especially with federal funding, they don't want you to be kind of that little pinpoint of the bullseye. They want you to be the big outside part of the bullseye. They want to see that you are reaching, not just this little piece of the population, but this big portion of the population. That's what they're looking for from you. They want to see that their dollars are being spread across as much of the community as is possible, okay? Also, when you are collaborating, you may want to consider doing a memorandum of agreement or a memorandum of understanding. so that you have a formalized agreement that says organization A agrees to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it's signed. And organization B agrees to do 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and it's signed. And organization C agrees to do 11, 12, 13, 14, and it's signed. So that if somebody within the group doesn't complete part of their task, there is some kind of backup that says, hey, you guys agreed to do this. We need to go back and figure out how to get this done. A lot of applications will require that you have MOAs or MOUs, but not all do. It's not a bad thing to do to protect you, especially if you are the lead organization and they are just sub-recipients of the money. So the person who submits the grant is considered the grantee. And if you are collaborating and giving money to other organizations, they are considered the sub-recipients. Okay. All right. So we also have letters of support. And the one that's most often left out is the one from the person that has been helped. That says, you know, this is what you did for our child, or this is what you did for our family, or this is what you did for our segment of the population within the community. Letters of support from politicians are required for some grants, but they're often just rubber stamp signed. So they don't hold the same level of weight as if you are having members of your community support you, or organizations like yours, having a university support the project that you're doing. Any of those things make a much stronger letter than just a political appointee or a political person signing your letter. A lot of grants will ask for a table of organization or an organizational chart. What is the hierarchy of your organization? Who reports to whom? They want to see that there is a chain of command reporting up to the board of directors or the board of trustees, whatever you call your advisory board. Then you need a copy of your bylaws. Okay. And so these will tell how you elect your board and how your organization is run. Then you need sample budgets with budget narratives. So I always recommend that you have a need budget, a want budget, and a dream budget. So your need budget is the absolute bare bones minimum that you need to operate that project. The want budget, okay, if I had an extra $10,000 to $20,000, this is what I could do. And then the dream budget is, okay, if I could have all the money that I really needed, this is what the project would look like. Someone asked a question about the letters of support. Should they be specific to the grant? The answer to that is yes. And they should also not all be the same. So don't ask CACI to write a letter and then have CACI forward that letter over to Gretchen and have Gretchen write a letter. That's exactly like CACI's. They want different letters of support. So these are the 24 items that you need. The only other thing that I will throw in really quickly, because I know I'm running out of time, is in the ARPA application that I saw, they asked for an emergency preparedness plan. And that is a new thing that I have not seen in a federal grant application prior to now. And I think they are doing that because of COVID. They don't want to continue to have to do ARPA funding cycles. They instead want to know, if a pandemic happens again, how will your organization be prepared to operate functionally without the ARPA funds? So again, I think that's what that's about. But CACI may be able to add a little more insight into that.
Thanks, Susie.
Sure.
I'm going to, unless CACI, do you want to jump on that right this minute? I am going to, there will be time in the question, in the Q&A, I think, to touch on that some more. Move things over to Mary Frances Porter. She is a consultant who works in evaluation. She's also worked with CNE for many years in teaching in this area, and worked with a lot of the nonprofits. And again, many of you have probably worked with Mary Frances at some point. So she's going to fill us in on a little bit of the evaluation piece. And there was a question about like, what's that evaluation statement? And hopefully through her talk, we'll learn a little bit more about that. Thanks, Mary Frances.
Thanks for having me. So like Susie, I usually do this kind of training over like sessions and sessions and sessions. So what I'm trying to do here is kind of give you guys like just sort of the high level looks, remind you what kinds of things are needed in evaluation, and then also provide you with some additional resources that you can go in and look at. And so, oh, it looks like I have a little bit of animation that I didn't anticipate, so I apologize for that. In thinking about the kinds of metrics and the kinds of information that that grantors want when they're trying to invest in an organization, some of that data is around organizational vitality. Some of that data is around being able to say that you're addressing real problems that are strategically aligned, like Kaki said, with things that are important in your community. Some of that data is from what you get from research that shows that your programs and strategies actually work to address those needs. And then the metrics that you're usually in charge of collecting are the productivity and the immediate impact that come from the work that you're doing. So Susie went through a lot of this, but organizational vitality essentially just says that you are capable of doing the work that you've put out in the grant. And that usually includes strong leadership, financial stability, having a really good reputation, and having strong collaborations and access to clients. And there's sort of two reasons. I think Susie had brought up collaborations, why collaborations are important. One is because you can serve more people if you guys are connected and able to refer clients between services. But more importantly, the kinds of things that most nonprofits are working to address are really complicated, multi-factored problems in the community. And when organizations are able to come together and support people in lots of different ways and support the community in lots of different ways, the chances of having real impact on the community increase. So the first thing that I wanted to give you guys some information on was addressing real problems, real community needs. So what are those community needs and demographics that are available? I have actually pulled together a whole bunch of different data sources that many of them are on the state level, but a lot of them you're able to go down into local levels and identify what kinds of needs are there. And those I've compiled in a data source tag in the resource library that I have on my website. That's what that QR is for. But then you may also need some additional local data, and local data, as you know, is really idiosyncratic. It depends on what your locality collects. Fortunately, a lot of times what I've noticed is that when people put out applications that are focusing on specific needs, the locality will often say, here's why we know this is a specific need. Other times you may be able to call the locality or talk to partners who are collecting data, like the health department or the folks that do the homeless census or something like that, and be able to get good local data that isn't what's collected more uniformly at the state level. One of the things Susie said that I think is really important is that all funders want to know that you are going to actually impact the community. And what we all know as, or you all know as actual providers of services, is that your ability to impact the community in reality is limited to the future efforts of the people that you serve. And so what's really important is when you're defending why you're doing the programs and strategies that you're doing, that you're able to talk about why those programs and strategies have been shown in the past to increase the likelihood that people are going to make long-term change, and that that's going to change the community. And there's a lot of research out there on the evidence-based practices, many of which that you guys are already implementing, that says, hey, we did this researchers did this long-term research, and they found out that if you give people access to affordable housing, then they end up getting better. And what I like to do is I like to be able to create a statement that I call an impact statement. And this is actually hot linked. I'll have Sandy send this out to you so you can reach it. But I create an impact statement that says, this is the programming that we're doing. This is how the programming has to be delivered. This is what the immediate impact is to the people who are getting that programming. This is how their behavior changes over time after they're resourced with that, with the programming. And here are the citations for it. And again, in the resource library that we have, we've actually collected lots and lots of different places that you can look for programming that has been demonstrated to work, because being able to make that argument is really what's critical in creating that link between people leave our programming with more stuff than they started with, but here's how we can defend why that stuff is going to be important for improving their lives and over time, improving the conditions in the community. The first thing that you are really going to be responsible for tracking is your productivity, which is also called outputs. And this is important, I think, probably especially for these kinds of grants, because this really shows the reach and the breadth of your service provision. And it can also be how you talk about whether or not you've met those critical, whether you've created critical and equitable access to services. Both things people are very interested in. I think when we talk about outputs, it kind of belittles the fact that this is really just how much opportunity you have for making impact. The things that are really important to focus on, of course, are the things that are most important to count, which would be the number of people and the characteristics of those people served, and essentially the number and types of services that you've delivered. It's usually much less important to talk about how many hours staff have worked, or how in this space, how much money it costs to deliver those services. This is really about the breadth and the resource, the reach, and whether or not people had access. Typically, most people I know who are in relatively small nonprofits, like under $3 million, typically use Excel or Google Sheets for this. And that can work really well. Paper, of course, is a really complicated way of doing it. It can feel better to the person holding the notebook and writing down what they did, but it means that you have to do a lot of compilation work at the end. So in general, I recommend that folks, if they have a database, to obviously be doing that. And if they don't, to set up some things in Excel or Google Sheets, and to be counting that daily. Because while this is kind of tedious to count, it's actually the easiest thing that you can possibly count in demonstrating your impact on the community. The other thing that you're going to be responsible for tracking is your impact, which is often called your short-term outcomes. And I like to think about this as the value of your services, what people get out of your services. And I have found that it almost can always be distilled down to knowledge, skills, abilities, motivation, and confidence that people have gained from working with you. You really don't want to be focused on the long-term or community level change that you want to be making, that you're defending in your programming statement, in your impact statement, but you're really looking at, what do people leave my programming with? How have I made them better resourced, clarified their goals, less unhappy, more motivated to take what I've taught them and make those changes in their life that they really want to be able to make. And so the knowledge and skills, that's really just the stuff you teach them. Almost all nonprofits have something where they're teaching people something. And then abilities, I think of as being access to something that they didn't have access to, or being able to overcome some barrier that they weren't able to overcome before. So maybe you're providing transportation, or maybe you're not just teaching people how to do job applications, but also teaching them how to be a little bit more confident. Or maybe you're helping address anxiety or depression or PTSD or something like that, that's kept them from actually being able to use knowledge and skills that they've had in the past. Motivation is whether or not people feel that they actually are going to take what they've gotten from you and apply it, and how likely they think it is that they're actually going to act on those. And confidence is their belief that they actually can do those things and overcome future challenges. You want to remember that whatever you give people, they may or may not use that right away, right? You might give them the keys to getting out of poverty, but for one reason or another, they aren't able to use those. I don't know, maybe COVID comes and there's some sort of economic collapse, or maybe there's a hurricane, or maybe their grandmother gets sick and they decide to go be with her as she's dying. And then once that's over, they come back and they're able to put those things into use that you gave them. So I always talk with nonprofits about really focusing on what it is that people leave their programming with. And usually exit surveys are enough for this. There are some things that people actually accomplish while you're working with them. So they may get credentials or licenses or a job or housing or something like that. Of course, you want to capture those. But a lot of times when you are looking to see whether people have gained knowledge, skills, abilities, motivation, and confidence, you just need to ask them, since participating in this project, in this service, have you gained knowledge, skills, abilities, motivation, and confidence? Another thing that I want to have people think about a little bit is that when you are asking people these questions in your surveys, a lot of times we think of them as really being something that is difficult and annoying for staff to do, and difficult and annoying for our clients to do. But lately, I've started to really think about surveying people as an equity issue, in that nonprofits, the value of your work isn't in how much money you make, which is how we determine the value of a business, right? Like, is the business profitable? The value of your work is in how much people change and whether or not people change from getting your services. However, in the business world, people are able to vote with their wallets. They're able to buy iPhones or not buy iPhones, or buy Air Jordans or not buy Air Jordans. But in the nonprofit world, people often don't have a choice about where they're receiving services, and they don't have a voice in whether or not those services are adequately meeting their needs. And so by actually asking them, you're giving them the same ability to provide feedback and talk about how services could be improved and what they got from them, as people who are buying services typically have. So that's just sort of a little sidebar for one of the reasons why I think surveying people is really important. And if you have that in your mind when you're doing it, it can really change the entire feel of how it is that you're asking people and receiving their feedback. So what I've done is I've written up like a little mini summary of the kinds of things that you might say, and talking about how you are likely to be successful. So I have a mock nonprofit here called Housing for All. And Housing for All here, they talk about why affordable housing is important, how the local need has changed in response to COVID. And then they say, and we do this. And we do this by providing sets of solutions, sets of evidence-based programs and strategies that have been demonstrated to show that people actually improve from having these services. In this case, for this grant, it might be additionally useful to talk about how you might be augmenting, increasing your reach, adding resources or whatever in any of these areas in order to be able to ensure that additional people are supported. I couldn't agree with Kaki more in sort of thinking about the fact that, starting something new with this money really wouldn't be a great way to do it, but talking about how you want to be able to reach more people than you did before because that need has increased. That's a really important thing to be able to do. But that's really just a statement on top of what you usually write when you're addressing this problem anyway. So then here's a very quick and dirty example of how Housing for All might tell their impact story. They might say that, between the beginning and the end, they were able to serve this many people. This was their characteristics. These are the groups of people that we served. And you can say something like, overall, 90% of the people we served gained the things that we wanted them to gain. And then you're making statements about the percentage of people who became housed, safer, or had knowledge gained, probably also including the number of people or percentage of people that had this benefit who were additionally impacted by COVID. What's particularly important when you provide these data back, I think, is also to be able to give little quotes and testimonials that help illustrate how this change actually felt for the people who received it. Because again, unlike just a regular business where you're selling iPhones and you're saying, oh yeah, we sold more than last quarter, we're also selling an experience, you're selling values, and you're selling an enrichment to people's lives. So being able to take that, that how many people got housed and then how that actually impacted somebody's life by using an illustrative quote is really useful. I want to give you just a couple of other quick things. I think I'm about to run out of time. One, I've hot linked my favorite logic model and theory of change websites here for you guys. For anyone who wants to brush up on that, I have a tool that I've created called a strategic impact map. But if you want to learn about that, you can contact me later and I'll teach you how to do it. But these are the tried and true things that grantors typically ask for. I want to remind you that metrics and performance indicators are just what you're measuring. They're the same as outputs, outcomes, productivity, impact. They're all just different ways of saying what are the numbers, what are the things that you're measuring. I've written a short white paper on how to talk to funders about the return on their investment, which could be helpful to be able to read when you're thinking about how to frame improving people's lives as opposed to making money to the funders and grantors that you're applying for. And then lastly, I want to remind you that you can, nonprofits are really only, can only be held to the standard of demonstrating impact. You can't prove impact. You are not the scientists. The researchers who've created programming, they have proved that there's impact. You're there just showing that people have gotten what you intended them to get out of the services that you've provided. So again, I feel like that was probably like 6 months of information crammed into a few highlights, but I'm happy to provide any other, answer any questions or provide any other resources that might be helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary Frances. I just shared through the Q&A the link to the resources on your website for folks, and mentioned that I would share that. That's the slides that you just presented with folks
Right.
after the fact.
And I edited them while we were talking, so I'll send them to you again.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
So if there's questions specific for Mary Frances, I'd like to take those first. So feel free to throw a question in the Q&A. There was a question that sort of came up earlier toward the end of Susie's talk, specifically about the evaluation statement in a grant proposal. And I don't know if Susie or Mary Frances is the best person to speak to that, but the question was sort of what is that evaluation statement and what needs to be included in that?
Susie, why don't you answer that? Because I'm not sure what you're defining as an evaluation statement, and then I can augment.
Yeah, sure. So depending on who you're writing to, I think that's part of the answer. So if you are doing a small private foundation grant, they may just want to know who you served, how you served them, how often you served them, and what was the impact to your community. They're looking for that in a thank you letter kind of statement. And so that is not what Mary Frances is talking about building with all this data and other information. It's much more of a, this is just what we did kind of answer. And so with a more formalized evaluation statement, they are really looking for pre and post surveys. They are looking for those data counts that Mary Frances is talking about. They are looking for how you're measuring your outcomes and outputs against what you're doing with the community and how those two cross over each other. So Mary Frances, if you want to pick up from there.
Yeah, so what I focus on is saying, okay, what are the handfuls of ways that helps me show the breadth and scope of the work that I'm doing. So how many people am I serving, and how much of those services am I putting out there? And again, that is simple counts, and you can literally just put a list, like we're going to count the number and characteristics of the people that we serve, and we're going to count the number of services that they get. That really focuses on all those outcomes, productivity. You can get fancier. There's lots of ways of slicing and dicing it, but it's nice and simple just to put those two things up there. Sometimes if you're doing outreach, it's really important to be able to say how many people like view your posts or something, or how many people are at presentations you make. But generally, it's just sort of the number of people you're touching and how much of a touch they get, how many services they get. The impact, you're finding out from people what they got from working with you. And sometimes I said those things are observable, like they got a high school diploma, or they got their GED, or they got a driver's license. Other times those things are things that you have to ask them. Did you learn more about this topic? Did you learn about this topic having been in this presentation? Having been in this presentation, do you now know more about this topic? Having been in this presentation, do you now feel more able to do the work that we're asking you? Having been in this presentation, do you feel motivated to take this forward and do it? And having been in this presentation, do you feel confident that you can use the information and use that in your world? Those are the outcomes that really most organizations provide, no matter what you're doing. You know, if you went to schools, you could ask kids, do you feel like you learned stuff that's going to help you succeed in life? If you're providing people health information, did you learn stuff about your health or how to manage your health that you didn't know before? If you're teaching them about how to do something, do you now know how to do it when you didn't know how to do it before? Do you feel more confident about starting a small business? Do you feel better about being able to get a job? Do you feel safer in your house? Do you sometimes you can count how many people are now in safe housing that weren't in safe housing, but a lot of times you're asking them. Some grants might require that you do pre-post. I tell people to avoid that at all costs unless it's demanded, because people don't know what they don't know when you ask them the pre. And so then when you ask them the post, you don't actually get as much change as you think you might. And actually, if they've learned a lot, you might actually get a reduction. And so what I always ask people to do, what I recommend people to do is they say, since participating in X, or since working with our organization, or since doing this, how much of this have you learned? Not much, a little bit, quite a bit, a whole lot. And then I do always ask people at the end to say one or two things that they've learned, maybe one or two things that they didn't like, because that's for you, so that you can learn what you need to do. And then I will often ask people on the survey to give a testimonial. You know, in order to be able to provide this service in the future, we really like to be able to collect testimonials from people about how this has helped you. Could you please, if you feel comfortable, write something about how we've helped your family or you, or something like that. And that's a nice, efficient way to be able to get some nice testimonials from folks.
Thanks for that. There was an earlier question, I think this was going back to Susie's presentation around the letters of support. And there was so we had one question about that already. And the second question was, can we use letters of recommendation, or do the letters need to be directed at the project you're seeking support for? So can they be sort of general, your organization is a great organization, they do great work, or does it need to be sort of like, this project you're proposing or this work you've been doing is fantastic?
I think it's probably fine to have one of those, but I think you do have to have more toward the other side, where you're actually showing support for what that grant is asking for funding for.
And I'm maybe very naive, but I think this goes back to the point that I've heard a couple of you make is maybe don't try to start something new with this, right? Is so you're pointing to some work that you've already been doing and saying, hey, look at that work, it's been great, we want to do more of it. And having someone write a letter about that seems a little easier than something that doesn't quite exist yet. Is there, I'm just going to give folks a few more seconds if there's any more questions from the audience to type those in and let us know. And I'm just sort of wondering if there's any of our panelists who have something that didn't come out, or that they thought of after the fact that they might want to add in now, and open the floor for those opportunities.
I think the only thing that I would say is if you are a group throughout the state, perhaps, that there are groups like you in every community, perhaps you all group together to approach the state for some of these ARPA funds, like Kaki was suggesting, that you do it as a collaborative group, and all of you are doing it and all of you are on board, so that it isn't just each of you trying to go to the state. You're representing the like entity across the state to the state. That would be my only other thing.
I feel like that also sort of touches on something I heard Kaki say about like, we don't need to feel in a panic about this necessarily. There is some time here, some time to be strategic about how we're seeking out this funding.
I would say that there's a tremendous expectation for transparency from the federal government for how local governments report out, how they use their money. I think that sort of almost in reaction to the CARES Act money, that there's a desire to have a great deal of sunlight around this. But it doesn't require that local governments do any kind of broadcast or notification about how they're making those determinations internally. So I wouldn't wait for some formal notice to come out, or to assume that there'll be some kind of statement about even a competitive process. And so I would use the relationships you already have to reach out and ask questions. How are you making these decisions? You know, there are huge decisions, I think, being made around the water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure across the state, with just using existing relationships that are already in place, and there's not necessarily a big sort of public conversation around that. And so there is money for the sort of social service, human service world to be particularly responding to emergent needs. And if you don't already know how your local government is making those decisions, then you need to reach out and ask. And I think it's important to be prepared to be able to make your pitch. We're doing this. Maybe you didn't know that we've expanded our emergency food service by 400% in the last year, because we've just been doing such a good job feeding people that you haven't heard about the need. But you need to be out there plugging away and telling people what you're doing. And then say, how can I provide information to you in a more formal way for consideration for ARPA funds? And then use what Susie and Mary Frances have said to craft your proposal in a way that is unbeatable, and they have to say yes to it. So but you have to get in the door and find out who needs to read it and who's gonna be making that decision. And I wouldn't assume that you're gonna go to your local government's website and they're gonna say, hey, you want some of that ARPA money? And click here. Because these conversations are happening on so many levels and in so many departments that there isn't necessarily going to be a unified response that is publicly facing about how to do that. So get in there, ask.
Okay. Mary Frances?
I was just looking at the Q&A from Gwendolyn, and I was going to answer that. Is that appropriate? Are you ready? Sure. So Gwendolyn, Gwendolyn asks, if we are essentially new with no budget and we are unable to answer metric questions because of how new we are, how do we explain the gaps in the information? So there's no way providing these services or you have been providing the services without collecting data. There's no way of getting around that. A couple of things that you could do would be to collaborate with someone who is collecting data or making sure that you're using programming that has been demonstrated to work, and using some of the testimonials you might have from the people that you're already serving. But the other fact of the matter is that you're going to have to start collecting data. So, setting up some either Google Sheets or Excel sheets where you start tracking how many people you're serving and what services those people get. And then also just giving people some surveys at the end of your service work with them before they leave. Don't mail them to them and expect them to mail them back. Don't try to call them later. That's going to be a waste of time and energy. Ask them while they're in your office before they walk out of the door. What are the knowledge, skills, abilities, motivation, and confidence that you've gotten from us? That'll get you on the way. And so what you're going to want to be doing is talking about how you plan to measure those things, maybe demonstrate that you have the knowledge or partnerships to be able to do those things, or be part of a collaborative where you have other people who have done that, and then you're able to say that you're going to be using the same kinds of metrics or using their expertise to build your metrics.
Thanks for that. Again, if there's questions, feel free to throw those in the Q&A. Speaking of metrics, I'm going to share with folks a great sample of, I hope a great sample of an evaluation form that you can use both in making up your own evaluation forms, but also please fill it out and let us know what knowledge, skills, and abilities you came away with from our panel discussion today. I should say that Mary Frances helped CNE build our evaluation system, and that much of the things you see coming from us on that front are due to her great work. I'm also just going to share a couple of other things. And again, if you do have questions in this time, please feel free to throw them up and I'll keep an eye on that. I wanted to mention that CNE has been doing a lot of work in sort of trying to get the word out about the 7 actual principles. Hopefully you've heard that phrase so far and have some understanding of what those are. They're a set of principles that we put together through conversations with community leaders, with nonprofit leaders, with doing research in sort of emerging trends and sort of understanding the nonprofit sector sort of outside of our area as well, and getting a sense of what are the things that a nonprofit really needs to have in place to thrive and succeed. And so we sort of, not me, but some very smart people who aren't me, boiled that down into these seven principles and have built those out with one, in-depth descriptions of what the principles are and how we might understand them in the context of the work we do, and also supplied workbooks to help organizations, especially at the leadership and board level, to really understand how to think about implementing or improving upon the ways those principles show up in your work. And then also an extensive library of resources and tools to help strengthen your organization in the various areas that come up with that. So you can find all of those many things on this this website that I've just popped into the chat there. We also have been doing a series of we call them info sessions, but really they're really short but very interactive and engaging introductions to each of the specific principles. So we have, I think, 2 more of those coming up, which you can see on CNE's list of upcoming trainings, which I'm going to share here. So those are hosted by Karen Click, a consultant who worked with CNE in developing the 7 actual principles and building out the website. So she herself is a great resource. And of course, there's always other things on that list of upcoming trainings for folks working in nonprofits, volunteering for nonprofits. So please keep an eye on that if you don't already. I am going to close things out by saying to all of our guests, thanks to our attendees for coming today. I will share the video recording of this presentation. I will share presentations and notes from our speakers, as well as some resources that we have put together for you. That's all I have, and thanks so much and have a great day.